This video was made possible thanks to my supporters on Patreon and Ko-fi. Hello everyone. So I've decided that I'm going to try my hand at making a bit of an off-the-cuff video here with no script, no notes, nothing. Let's see how it goes. I wanted to talk about what it is that makes Israel as a settler colony different to other settler colonies, such as the USA, Australia, Canada, etc., and why it is that we seemingly focus so much on fighting Israel as a settler colony and not so much those other places. This is in response to a pretty common talking point that you might see, often from Zionists themselves, but also sometimes from other people, where they come in and say, hey, if Israel is a settler colony and that's so bad, why don't you look more back at home and get your own stuff in order before you come and single Israel out? I saw very recently this comic, for example, posted by an open, rabid right-wing Zionist account, which is clearly making that sort of argument, where it's like, if Israel is a settler colony, what about the Native Americans? Why are you protesting against Israel? So generally, this talking point is brought up to deflect. It's a way for them to avoid dealing with what you're actually talking about in regards to Israel by just saying, well, you're a hypocrite, or something like that. Nonetheless, it is something that you can respond to, very easily in fact. So I'm going to answer that question right here in this video. At its core, this is not exactly a wrong thing to say. Israel is a settler colony, obviously. And by settler colony, what I mean is a state where in its present form, it was specifically formed by people who came from elsewhere with the intention to get rid of and exclude as many of the people who were already there beforehand and form their own new society and state on the ashes of theirs. Of course, it can be more complicated, but just for a quick working definition for this video, that's what I'm talking about. And yeah, that describes Israel, but it also describes the USA, Australia, Canada, many other places as well. So at the core of it, at the heart of it, it's not exactly a wrong thing to point out. Where it is different, though, is in the stage that these different settler colonies are at. Australia, the USA, Canada, etc. In those countries, the dominance of the settler colonial state is very much consolidated and has been for a very long time, generally more than 100 years in all of those cases. That makes it a lot more difficult to fight against, both in non-violent and violent terms. Could you imagine, for example, a Native American resistance movement in the USA that actually took up arms? I would think that on a moral and ethical level, what they would be doing would be justified, but on a strategic level, it would not work very well at all. They would not be able to extract any concessions, and they would just end up getting completely crushed by the state. Any sort of hope of winning a struggle or getting any sort of return from a struggle of that sort is completely gone. Same thing with, for example, like a boycott campaign or something like that, sanctions campaign, something like that. You're obviously never going to be able to convince anyone to boycott or sanction the USA, Canada, or Australia on anything resembling a reasonable level. That's just sort of a non-starter, because the settler colonial state in these countries has consolidated itself to the point where it's seen as legitimate by most other countries. This is not yet the case in Israel, and that is really the fundamental difference. When we advocate against Israeli settler colonialism, it's not so much the same thing as us advocating against, say, American settler colonialism now. It's more like advocating against American settler colonialism in like 1820 or something, at a stage where the settler colonial state was still very much in a relatively early stage, still trying to consolidate itself, where resistance and boycotts and sanctions, if they could have existed during that time, were not nearly as futile as they are now. The correct comparison between what Israel is doing in Palestine now and the settler colonial states is not Israel versus them now. It's Israel versus the USA immediately following the Trail of Tears, or even during the Trail of Tears, just to give you one example. So, ask yourself, if you, who you are now today, could go back in time right before the Trail of Tears or right after it, and you could take a side. You could advocate for or against whatever you could during that time period. What would it be for? I would like to think that if it was me, I would be on the side of the Native Americans. And I think for most people, including a lot of people who support Israel, they would at least like to think that they would side with the Native Americans as well. And that's a stage of colonialism that Israel is carrying out in Palestine right now. So these are all settler colonial states, absolutely, but they are at different stages. And settler colonialism is a lot easier to fight in its earlier stages. Imagine, for example, like an alternate universe where the Native Americans, while they were being forcibly removed and massacred by the American state, were filming it on their smartphones and uploading the videos for everyone all around the world to see. And the world was as interconnected as it is now. I would hope that in this alternate universe, the world would unite against what the USA was doing. And that is the analogy to Palestine right now. Not the USA today, rather the USA 150 plus years ago. The Palestinian situation also has a lot of other advantages that many of these other settler colonial states, the indigenous people in these settler colonial states, didn't have. For example, the Palestinian people are united into one singular national identity. When it comes to fighting colonialism, that is very, very useful. If you think of the USA, Canada, Australia, etc., the Native American nations were very fragmented, and rarely did they ever actually unite into sort of a united front, like a united group. And even when they did, they still were competing with each other's, different group interests, different nations' interests while doing that. There was nothing like Palestine right now, where you have what is more or less an even population of indigenous people fighting against roughly the same population of settlers. And they might have different factions between them. There might be like the PA versus Hamas. But fundamentally, these people conceive of themselves as being of the same nationality. And that is a big advantage, something that indigenous people in the places that I mentioned never had. And as I just went over, the interconnectedness of the world today also makes things very different. It means that we can see what's happening. It's a lot easier to advocate against it, to put international pressure on Israel against what they're doing, something that, in 1820 was absolutely, completely impossible. Israel is basically trying to do 19th century style settler colonialism in a 21st century world. It's been doing it since well before 1948, really since the 19th century when the Zionist movement began, and it's still ongoing today. What we're seeing in Gaza right now as I make this video is Israel trying to consolidate its settler colonial state in the same way that was done in the US, Australia, Canada, and other settler colonial states. And we can struggle against that. We can make sure that it doesn't happen again. We can make sure that Israel is not allowed to get to this stage of really well-consolidated settler colonialism where indigenous people are completely marginalized, as has happened in Canada, the USA, and Australia. Right now, the struggle is easier. We should not wait until later to when it's going to become much harder or borderline impossible. And that is what makes the struggle of Palestine against Israel different. Not so much that Israel is not a settler colonial state, just like those other examples that I went over, rather that it is far, far, far easier and far, far, far more realistic to fight against it at the stage that it is currently at. And also due to the interconnectedness of the world that we live in today compared to back then. In Palestine, a prospect of a one-state with no settler colonial relations remaining is a realistic thing that can be achieved. In places like the USA, Canada, and Australia, I honestly could not tell you how that could be done. Whereas in Palestine, fighting against Israel is simply a matter of massive international pressure with resistance on the ground complementing it. And eventually, Israel will be forced to concede. It will be forced to give up its dream of an exclusive settler colonial ethno-state solely for ethnic Jews at the expense of the Palestinian people. In Palestine right now, while it might not seem like it, settler colonialism is at a stage where an alternate future can be formed. We don't need to accept its consolidation. We should fight against it. And I'm sure the vast majority of indigenous people in the world, even in these states where settler colonialism has become much more difficult to struggle against, would agree with me there. So using them as sort of tokens to be like, ha ha ha, you're against Israel, but you're not against your own country, which is also a settler colonial state. You're a settler just like we are, ha ha ha, is very stupid. Just an invalid argument, an attempt to avoid the point in the first place, and also a very unflattering comparison for them to make, because when they make that comparison, they're implying that the Native Americans are Palestinians, and the Israelis are the settlers. I don't think that's a very good comparison to make if you are pro-Israel. I think it actually paints you in a very unflattering light. Anyway, so yeah, this was just a quick off-the-cuff video where I wanted to sort of see how I can do just talking about something like this. Thoughts I already had developed in my head about the need for too much sourcing or whatever. Let me know if you liked it. That's about it. Yeah, that's really all I got to say.